Okay.
We're streaming live.
Now
Good.
streaming live. Okay. Good morning, worlds. My name is Allie Jones, and I'm the Executive Director of Teachers Global. Our mission is to build quality math education programs through collaborative partnerships that drive greater social justice. Thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion on math for anti-racism. Being anti-racist requires more than just not being racist. It requires actively working to challenge racism and to dismantle it in yourself, in others, and in society. Today's topic is important to me because I think quality math education strengthens the critical thinking skills and courage we need to effectively practice anti-racism in our daily lives. It's a long road for all of us, but math class can help to prepare us for a better journey together. I'd like to introduce Chad McGlone, who co-founded Teachers to Teachers Global with his wife, Jenny. First and foremost, however, he is a mathematics educator with a passion for building knowledge and partnerships. Also joining us today is Robert Berry, who received his PhD just a few years before Chad under the same advisor, Carol Malloy. Robert just finished serving as president of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics and is a chaired professor at UVA. You both bring a lifetime of experience in the mathematics education world, and I'm so grateful to have you here today. I prepared some questions, but thought I'd offer this space to either of you to see if you want to share anything before we get started.
You know, I'd like to start by saying how excited I am to be working with Robert and having him here in this meeting. Robert was in the very first class. He was leading the first class with Carol that I ever sort of experienced that was student-centered. And I came into that class with a master's in statistics, thinking I knew everything there was about the subject. And I was blown away by my classmates. And part of the reason I was blown away by my classmates is because Robert would come out and put his hand on my shoulder and say, listen, don't talk so much, and transform the way I taught. And so I'm so excited to be talking with him now. He's been a mentor of mine, watching him sort of like my big brother, sort of graduating before I did and trying to follow in his footsteps as a graduate student at least. So thank you for being here, Robert.
Well, thank you so much, Chad, for that. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, so, you know, my experiences at Carolina with Carol Malloy and all of the others, when I say others, graduate students who come to the program, you know, there's significant evidence of her impact on all of us, and it's been sustainable over a long period of time. So yeah, I think that commonality that we all share, rooted in the care and the nurturing of Carol Malloy, is highly significant. So yeah, thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Just to show you the impact of teachers. So first question for today is, how does quality math education drive social justice at all? So I think about this a lot because you know, I do not come from a teaching background and am still very passionate about teaching math for social justice because I've learned a lot about it and very much now see how the two connect. But I know that there are a lot of people out there in the world who are just like how I used to be and don't know about how math class is important for social justice. So I just want to start from that place of how are these two things even linked at all?
Well, I'll jump in and see if I can. So when we think about teaching mathematics for social justice, I think one of the things that we have to consider is you know, too often we have to center the mathematics and the social justice topic. These things, math is socially constructed. We do math for a reason. And too often math happens in spaces that are independent of social constructs. You know, so there's oftentimes you might hear this, like there's school mathematics and there's real mathematics. And somehow we have to figure that out. You know, when I say figure that out, school mathematics should not be independent of what happened in the lives and the experiences of people. People use math for a reason. And this is where the intersection between social justice and critical math and all of these ethnomathematics, all of these topics intersect in very interesting ways. Because, you know, when I believe all people are math people, because you use math pretty much daily for some reason. And how do we elevate that mode or that thought, that thinking? And sometimes we have to make it explicit to people. Now, when we move from social justice and think about how do we then use mathematics to bring about change, that is this is where I think sometimes we fall short for people who engage in mathematics for social justice. So we have a social justice goal, we have a mathematics goal, we engage in the mathematics, and we examine the social justice topic. But then there's another thing that we have to do. Now we have to go out and change. How do we create change agents? and that is the significant part. Sometimes I think we miss when we experience it in classrooms and school, is then what is the thing that you're going to do as a result of having this experience? And so that's the thing I hope that we can delve into a little bit more.
Wow. So because I've often thought about, Teresina Nunez talks about the street math and the school math. And
Right.
I love that idea, and how really they're the same math. We have to connect it. And that's sort of what you're talking about. It seems like context is a really important way of doing that. So does it need to be the context that the students are familiar with, or can it be a context that the students are learning about?
So, so I think both. I don't think it's either. And so, because I think we can use mathematics and social justice in context as a awareness raising for some. So when you think about kind of different spaces where people may be, in some ways we just want to raise people's awareness of the topic. And now that we've raised their awareness, now we can bring about, kind of this idea of what are we going to do as a result of raising one's awareness. And the other is, so if the topic or the context is familiar, it is now, okay, is there something I can do to shift this? It's not about me, it's about my community, it's about the people. And so this is the idea where we might think about who's advantaged and who's disadvantaged in context.
Wow.
And once we think about who's advantaged and disadvantaged, and think about how people experience context differently, or in some cases similarly, we still then have to figure out, does that create the space where people can engage and be who they envision for themselves and who they envision for their communities? And this is where I think we can still use mathematics to unpack, the inequities and I would say the equities that sit in those spaces. So being familiar with that as well, being familiar with the context, can help with that. But then there's this element of awareness raising as well.
Yeah, I love that.
I think for me, awareness is definitely not enough, though, to take it back to your change point, and also to the anti-racism point, is that being aware of racism and just not being racist is not enough. That you have to make the next step to actually take action and generate change. And awareness is not enough.
Okay. I love that point, and the thinking about what does it mean to be an agent of change. And as a teacher, I had this silly goal that I would like every class per student to leave my class going, my life has changed a little bit today. Of course, that doesn't happen every day, but you want to see it happen some. If I'm thinking about creating agents of change, do I want every single student to be an agent of change, or am I content to have a portion of them be agents of change and others thinking differently about things? What should my goals be?
Wow. So, yeah, so that is interesting, because I think we all bring resources to the experience. And I think the impact of that experience might be, is differential. When I say differential, I'm really thinking about, there may be elements of the context that people may find nuance in differently from others, may want to work, while there's a collective being, I think there are elements that the nuance matters. And this is where I think, Chad, when you mentioned the context, while we might be in similar contexts, it is the nuance that matters, where we experience something, have an experience in math, about math, and I might see that context in a nuanced way differently than you see it, but we might be working on the same or similar issue.
Wow.
And this is where we collectively come together to say, well, yeah, and bring our work together collectively. And so the nuance in which I think those pieces come together in very interesting ways on a larger problem.
Yeah, that's powerful. The nuance bit. That's something as a teacher I want to think about.
Okay, so I think actually this takes us right into the next question, which is on how do we talk about the hard things? So how can math class be a place where we talk about the hard things and also build solutions for how to improve them in real life? I think particularly when we reflect on failure and confronting failure and the anxieties that come with math on a times table, and the idea that there's only one way to solve a problem, and there's like all these other pressures too involved in math class itself. How can we kind of tackle all of that and use math class as a space to be more courageous in how we acknowledge what we know and what we don't know, and then work together to build a solution for something better together?
That's a big question.
Just wait till you see the follow-up.
Well, I think, so the conversations about the heart. So the moment in time in which we're experiencing right now, I think it brings about ways that we can have the conversations about some things in a way that we weren't able to have it, I would say, over a year ago, if I can just timestamp it. So issues around race, issues around healthcare, issues around, even, hey, let's talk about social distancing. What does that mean? That's an area problem right there, right? And a lot of schools are trying to solve this area problem around social distancing if their goal is to get back into schools, and they're realizing, hey, oh wow, in order to meet this social distance guideline, do we have enough space? And so that's mathematics. So we can talk about the mathematizing of things in a way that brings in the socialization and the context. And so, and then it raises the question, since we don't have enough space, if I'm using a social distance example, what do we do? And so it really kind of brings in the question, even issues around race. I mean, I live in Virginia. And Virginia is a very interesting state. And I don't live too far from Richmond, Virginia. And then I don't know if you know the context with the Confederate monuments and all of those things, and the things that people are doing to raise issues around the history around that. But also there's these interesting conversations about cost analysis, about removing those monuments, the weight of the monuments, the placements of the monuments, all of those things. That's mathematics. And so it lends itself to these interesting conversations around those monuments. Even when you think about the historicized nature of it, when did these monuments come up? And why did they come up at the time when they came up? And so you can have these conversations in the context of learning about, I saw a graph in our local newspaper where we saw at what time were the monuments erected. And there was kind of the late 1800s through the 1920s. And then there was another boom, so to speak, if I can use boom in this context, in the late 1950s to the mid 1960s. Well, why at those two times? I mean, when you examine that mathematical representation, why at those two times? And what was the history and the context that was going on at those times? And so we can use math to critique, examine, and unpack the world. But more importantly, it provides us a leeway to have these kinds of conversations.
You've given us a global math story, because the content story about the monuments and how they were built would be fantastic, and to do the lesson from it. So let's say I'm a parent in a rural school, and you come to teach my students, my kids, and by the nature, social justice is really pushing kids to think differently, maybe than I want them to think. And in today's world, you see us a real polarized country that we have. How do you, as a teacher, talk about teaching your students and whose parents may have different views than you? How do you sort of find that balance?
And so I really do think, you bring up global math stories. I think there's stories. I mean, so it is the nuance in the stories. I do think that we then, so oftentimes I think about this, and I cannot, so I give credit to one of my colleagues at Iowa State, Krista Jackson. She uses the frame, listen, act, and engage. And so as we begin to think about, some issues around topics that may be highly sensitive. And so I think, listen, and so, so how do we create the spaces that so people can be heard? People want to be heard. And so, and even in mathematics, we made, in other talks I've given, I said, we're purely thinking about math. Those who are heard are often positioned as being competent. So how do we broaden the space of competency? And so we have to have, even in a highly emotional setting, people want to be heard. Now, we have to help people manage those emotions and think about how they might manage those emotions. But for the most part, they want to be heard. So I think that's the listen part. And that's as a result of being heard, how do we then act on what we've heard? It is now building, I won't say bridges, but perhaps helping people understand the multiple perspectives that people might bring to an issue. And those multiple perspectives are even if we disagree, I do want you to acknowledge that I have a perspective that is different from yours, and just try to have some level of empathy or understanding about how those perspectives impact my worldview about this topic that we're dealing with, even in the rural setting, and engage. Then, so, okay, now that we have this, what are we going to do? There's something common. We have to find the element of commonness. When I say that sounded wrong, common.
New word, I love
common.
Yeah. Try that with friends.
We have to find those elements that we find in common. And this is where I think someone like a teacher can be helpful, in terms of, unpacking and understanding the different perspective, but also trying to figure out where's the common areas, and dealing with parents and dealing with community members, and then dealing with those who may have different views on a situation or context. And so, and then so that way, there's still, I'm not going to claim that this may solve an issue, but I do think what it does, it creates the possibility that people can engage in a civil way, and not imply that they're, and engage in a way that is respected of one another.
So a great teacher is able to do that while teaching or helping students discover the formula for slope. That's a pretty amazing task for a mathematics educator.
Yeah, even in your example, the formula of slope, I mean, it might mean that, we can look at ADA issues as it relate to slope. We can look at, so the challenge of that would be is, how do we then help teachers understand the possibilities of mathematizing context, community, and other things. And so, yeah, when you said slope, I thought ADA, I thought all of these other things. So it is, and I know my experiences are different from others, but then, it is about, well, how do we work with people to help them kind of build those things? And this is where I think storytelling comes into play. I really do think when we begin to listen to people's experiences, listen to their stories, I think we understand their motivations. And stories can be highly motivating, understand. And once we understand their motivations, I think we then begin to act, engage, and understand. And so, but is I'll be the first to admit that is just not easy. It really isn't. That is hard work. And so too often, when people say, "I want to teach a lesson on XYZ that is social justice first," what work did you do first? You just can't jump in and teach a lesson. You got to do the work first.
Yeah.
And when I say do the work, it is, how do you make sense of the context? How do you make sense of the social justice issue? How do you make sense of all of that? If you haven't done that work first, then you may be doing a disservice just jumping in and teaching a lesson that you may not have the requisite background for engaging in the kinds of conversations, just in case a parent does have an issue or a community member have an issue with the topic that you're dealing with. So do the work first before you jump into trying to teach mathematics for social justice.
Mm-hmm. And then experience what a joy it is to teach something like that.
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing.
The rewards are great. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. That's fantastic. I love that you're saying that. That's exactly the kind of thing I'm thinking about. And I think there's a real opportunity here, just really quickly, to say it's impossible to teach that way and lecture. So to me, when you start with social justice, that helps a teacher move from out in front of the classroom into the classroom with the students. So I think there's a real power to transform instruction in this same kind of work.
And I would add to it, probably might be impossible to do. It has to be multidimensional.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I say multidimensional, you might bring in other elements. So this is where you bring in, it depends on what you're teaching, maybe books, children's books, videos, all these things to really understand the multiple perspectives that one has around the issue, and then unpacking the mathematics around the issue, having a social justice goal and a mathematics goal.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
When you talk about doing the work, it makes me think about our own team. Because obviously we've been talking about this a lot as an organization, and looking at other companies and other organizations and what they're doing, and thinking about what this means for our work. And we've been talking about what is the real plan we're going to do for our organization, so that in the future, well, for our own team now, and in the future when we bring new people in, that it can be a real thoughtful, intentional training program to prepare everybody that is doing this work with the right kind of tools and exposure to ideas and experiences that can help them be better prepared to be an advocate in whatever way that makes sense for them. I also wanted to mention that we talk, like Chad, I've heard you mention a few times in this call, just the idea of thinking differently, and that math is something that can help you do that, and through developing critical thinking skills. I almost think about that piece as being more thinking for yourself, because it's this idea that through seeing and believing and experiencing that there's multiple ways to see a problem and to solve a problem, you start to develop this idea that like you get to pick which one you like and which one you get to use. But it's important to recognize that there are those different perspectives and to try them all on. I don't know, I think there's something kind of in that piece of helping kids to realize that it's on them to figure out what they think, and that can lead to change, because that's empowerment, right? Is internalizing that it's up to you to decide what you think and to go on and challenge systems and move on. So.
Yeah, great point.
And Ali, what I think you just described is what I would probably tag as kind of being metacognitive about the work that we're doing. Mm-hmm. When I say being metacognitive, so you may solve a problem one way, Chad solves a problem another way, and then as a teacher, one gives you both the space to share your thinking. So Robert, myself, I'm sitting in the classroom listening to both of you. I am now thinking not only about how I solve the problem, I'm thinking about how you solve the problem, how Chad solved the problem, and then trying to make sense of what elements of your strategy that I'm going to try to incorporate or not incorporate into my
Right.
strategy. And so this idea of, yes, you're thinking individually about your work, but now you're moving to this metacognitive space where you're really thinking about others people thinking and figuring out how to integrate that. So how does that now, that metacognition, translate from mathematics to a social justice issue? And I think it works
So when
very
you talk about
similar.
math as a language, what you just described is what always comes to mind for me. And then I think the translation of that into society is what could change the world, because it's the like the ability to speak another language, whether that's actually another language or not, is not the point, right? It's not literal language necessarily, but like it's the interest in doing so and the curiosity in seeing that person's perspective or that way of seeing the world, and so that you can engage more effectively.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it raises questions. There's a certain amount of energy of snowballing, I would say. When I say snowballing, it is the snowballing means that we're connecting, we're building together around this concept, around this idea, and that we both contributed to this snowball, so to speak, and trying to make sense of the world. I mean, and make sense of the context. And so, yeah. It doesn't happen independently, but it does happen independently and both collectively as we connect with one another.
Yeah.
Oh, love these conversations. Great. Okay. We have a question.
Yeah, that's right.
So question is for Dr. Berry. Do you think that we need to refocus our math content, especially in middle and high school, on the importance of developing students' mathematical or financial literacy? That seems to be an area that could have a huge impact on equity and justice.
Wow, that's a big question as well. And so I do think, so financial literacy and helping people understanding the issues around financial literacy. I think there's a larger conversation about, where we think about not only personal finances, but also kind of more, how does financing the industry impacts people and communities, and having to understand that these two things are not independent of one another. And that, when you think about the larger financing industry, my own personal finances, how does policy, regulation, and those issues impact me personally, but also how did my own personal budgeting and financing impact my family, my community, and other spaces. So I do think that we have to have some issues or experiences and students understanding that. My concern is too often when we talk about financial education, we primarily focus on budgeting, check writing, those kinds of things. While those things are important, I can push back who really writes checks anymore, but while those things are important, I do think there's a larger conversation that has to happen where we see the connections around how the larger issue impacts the personal issue of people. And right now, I mean, this is the timing, our moment that we're in right now is people are, budgets are tight. And issues are being and issues are being made around budgets. When we think about this, issues, a social justice issue comes up around defunding the police. What does that mean? Or what does defunding schools mean? Have schools always been defunded? And what does that mean about my personal self-efficacy as it relates to my my personal financing as well? So I know I probably over answered that question, but hey, I'm sorry.
No, I don't think you over answered at all. I mean, these are all the big questions. We are just about out of time. So I wanted to just thank you both so much for your time and for your brains. I always joke with Chatty, he's a big bike rider, just please wear your helmets. So today I'm going to say, please wear your masks. You know, I'm in Texas. I'm very close to Houston right now, and it feels very, very present. So everyone, please, the PSA from teachers to teachers, please wear your masks and stay safe. Thank you very much.
Well,
Thank you,
great day.
Robert.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Take care.
All right.